Paola Giusti-Rodriguez from the University of Florida. We'll talk about Latin American Genomics Consortium, meaningful partnerships to advance psychiatric genomics in Latin America.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here and to speak to you about the consortium, and thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all today. So before I get started on the science, my lab works on I'm at the University of Florida in the Department of Psychiatry, and my lab focuses on three major areas. First, in terms of diversity, we focus on increasing participation of investigators and research participants from diverse backgrounds in psychiatric genetic studies. We also employ multi-omic approaches to understand psychiatric disorders, and then we collaborate with neuroscientists at the McKnight Brain Institute at UF to interpret these findings. In terms of the work in the diversity space, which is what I'm going to focus on today, there's a lack of diversity in psychiatric genomic studies. So Hispanic or Latino individuals are underrepresented across genome-wide association studies and other types of large-scale genomic studies in general. As shown on the graph on the left and the middle panel, using this is from the GWAS Diversity Monitor. We're underrepresented both in terms of general GWASs and definitely, as I'm showing on the right, in terms of psychiatric genetic studies. And this is something that's still lagging overall, large-scale genetic studies for psychiatric disorders. We can see that, as I'm showing in different colors for the proportions of the populations here on the, which ones? Yeah. These are the proportions world populations, and this is from for different psychiatric disorders, the different populations, how they're represented in published studies. And you can see that individuals of European ancestry are overrepresented in psychiatric GWAS studies compared to other global populations. And obviously, this exclusion or underrepresentation of other populations kind of prevents us from taking full advantage of the resulting discoveries, and especially in terms of potential clinical applications and precision medicine approaches. Within the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, which is a worldwide collaboration that is this largest consortium in psychiatry, involves over 800 investigators from over 50 institutions. There's a clear underrepresentation both in terms of the investigators that are doing this psychiatric genetic studies, as well as the samples that are under study. So on this graph on the left, I'm showing co-authorships on papers by the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium, and you can see that while it is clearly global, there's regions of the world that are very overrepresented, and other areas of the world, especially in Central, South America, the Caribbean, Africa, other areas of Europe that are very poorly represented as co-authors in these papers. And in terms of the samples that are under study, again, we can see that many regions of the world are overrepresented in terms of the samples that have been sequenced or genotyped, and that we have big gaps in terms of other regions. Now, there's definitely room for improvement, and there's a lot of efforts right now to correct this. But in terms of what's published right now, it's still not super uplifting. And especially for Latin America, as I'm from Puerto Rico, and this is sort of part of the reason that I'm involved in this. If you're not super familiar with genetics studies in terms of GWAS and populations, this underrepresentation impacts every stage of the research enterprise. So from the target population, how you're recruiting these participants, sort of what community partnerships you have, what language, cultural understanding of the populations that you're trying to recruit, the assessments that are available, both that have been translated and validated in these populations, the types of arrays that you use to genotype these samples, which for a long time had mainly variants found in European populations and lacked a lot of variants that are more common for other populations, as well as the reference panels that we're using to interpret these findings, and the methods that account for the population, like the population structure and the complex admixture that's represented across the region. And then when we go from our, there's a lot of lack of methods for admixed populations, as I'll talk about later in my talk. And once you have your genome-wide association studies and so forth, you need to then interpret these findings. And in terms of functional annotation, we have also a severe gap in terms of the data that's out there, generated either from tissue, samples, cells that are coming from these underrepresented populations. And again, when we talk about clinical applications, like polygenic risk scores, this is impacted because of if we fault at every step of this sequence of events. Obviously, this is not going to be great for when you have data that's coming mainly from Europeans to other ancestral groups and other admixtures. And so, there's many reasons for this underrepresentation, but obviously one of the biggest ones is the lack of funding. So here I'm showing research and development expenditures as percentage of gross domestic product, and this is data coming from the World Bank. Again, I'm highlighting Latin America. And if you think about the U.S. spends about 3.5% of their GDP on research and development, you can see that across the region there's a severe underinvestment in science, right? And that impacts both the type of science that gets done, the capacity, the facilities that are available, and definitely the output in terms of investigators, publications, and also brain drain, right? So you have the talented scientists leaving their countries to go to Europe, the U.S., etc., to get their degrees, and many times they don't have opportunities to go back to their countries to do their science there. And there's additional barriers for research in Latin America specifically, in terms of research capacity. We have also, lack of collaborative opportunities across the region. There's very different access to genomics and computing infrastructure. And in terms of admixed populations, like I'm showing here on the right, I'll explain it in a minute, there's a lack of adequate methods that can account for the complex admixture that's very representative of the region. So here I'm showing, if we think about individuals that are from North America, Central, South America, and the Antilles, we can see that if we look at their genomes, you have this really complex admixture all over the place. And some countries have, like Brazil, you have people that are mainly European ancestry and individuals that are mainly African ancestry. And so this becomes complicated when you're analyzing genetic data. Geneticists love more homogeneity when they're analyzing samples. And for a long time, samples that were from individuals that were non-European or admixed were just tossed out. So they would they would do the studies, they would collect the samples, and they would not include them in the analysis. And so, this is, I think, both a really interesting and really challenging problem, because we need to figure out ways to parse their genomes in a way that obtain meaningful data and that is applicable broadly, because many times we're talking about common variants in general, but that we can also look at environmental factors interacting with genetics and so forth. And despite all of this, psychiatric genetic studies do get done in Latin America. There's a lot of psychiatric geneticists in the region. And I want to highlight, for example, in Brazil, they have this Brazilian high-risk cohort for mental conditions. And in Mexico, they have this Mexican genomic database for addiction research, which have been super productive in terms of the output of investigators that can engage in these studies. They have, I think, about 2,000 or 1,500 samples each. They have lots of functional genomics data, RNA sequencing, imaging. And so they're doing a lot despite the limited amounts of funding. And these are just some of the papers that have come out from those efforts. In terms of to parse that data, right? So thankfully, in the last few years, there's been a lot of efforts to develop methods that can be used to analyze these admixed populations in genome-wide association studies. And this is one example of Tractor, which uses local ancestry in order to really parse the genomes, the different contributions of different ancestries in individuals who are admixed. And this was developed by Dr. Elizabeth Atkinson, now at the Baylor College of Medicine. And so in 2019, you're missing one L, but in 2019, about 25 of us got together at our main conference, which is the World Congress of Psychiatric Genetics, and decided to kind of put together this Latin American Genomics Consortium. Since then, we've grown to over 125 active members, representing 9 different Latin American countries, Puerto Rico and the United States. And importantly, more than 70% of our members are from Latin America. And so our major goal is to advance psychiatric genomic studies in Latin America. And within that big goal, we want to increase sample sizes, contribute to recruitment and genotyping locally that will, where the data will stay in this country, that they can advance methods within their countries, data analysis, develop methods for these complex samples, and contribute to education and training with capacity building efforts. And so I'm just showing here these are all the institutional affiliations of our members as of 2023. The leadership of the LAGC, so we have 3, I'm one of the 3 co-chairs. There's also Dr. Yanisa Montalvo Ortiz at Yale University, Elizabeth Atkinson at Baylor College of Medicine, and we have 2 members that were selected by our members. Dr. Humberto Nicolini at the Instituto Nacional de Medicina Genómica Mexico, and Dr. Marco Santoro at Universidad Federal de Sao Paulo. And they are, together with me and Janitza, we've been added since 2022 to the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium Coordinating Committee, which is sort of like the umbrella committee coordinating activities of the consortium. We're being able to advocate for our membership, and that has led to like funds being allocated for activities for the consortium, such as financing like participation at the conference for trainees who are from lower middle income countries. And just last September, we organized a 2-day training in bioinformatics for our members. And then, I should also say that this has also led to creation of work groups that are focused on specific phenotypes and traits. And so these are really helping to bring together investigators that have similar interests in different psychiatric disorders to start putting together like meta-analysis, compile data, apply for funding together, and so forth. We have Dr. Sheila Nagamatsu, a postdoc with Dr. Janitza Montalvo Ortiz, looked at sort of the numbers in terms of the representation of our membership. And we, as I mentioned, 70% of our members are from Latin America. We've seen a growth in terms of like the numbers from 2021 to 2023, both in terms of the country of origin and like more diversification in terms of country of origin and of residence and academic affiliation. And we're really keeping a close eye just in terms of do we have trainees in our membership? Do we have early, mid, and and advanced faculty, as well as like good gender representation in our membership? We also Sheila also did an analysis looking at sort of the publications that included members of our consortium, and we found that from 2021 to 2023, we could already see an like increased engagement in publications between members of the consortium, and we can see that this is going to keep growing in the next few years as we have several current analyses underway and publications that are being worked on together by our members. One of the things that has taken a lot of effort over the past 4 years has been just like aggregating, applying for access, aggregating, and putting together all these like samples, like small groups of samples sometimes that are kind of like dispersed across all these efforts. And so we've been really targeting different consortia that have larger sample sizes from individuals of Latin American and then this is just an example of like we've been able to secure access to both SumStat and raw data for both U.S. and Latin American-based cohorts. And at this point, we have access to over 200,000 samples. And we're leveraging that for a number of phenotypes. We're starting with alcohol use and cigarette and smoking, just because these are two traits that are well captured across many of the different like samples that we have collected. And the idea is that we would carry out either a standard or local ancestry tract or GWAS. We'll look at multiple phenotypes, examine genetic correlations, and calculate multi-ethnic polygenic risk scores for these. We're also working on establishing best practices. And so we want to kind of make it easier for our members to be able to analyze, carry out together these meta-analysis. So we have methods work group that kind of works above all the other disease-specific work groups to share standardized pipelines for their implementation. And we are now doing GWAS meta-analysis of alcohol consumption that's going to be submitted in the next few weeks, as well as a review that examines functional genomics publications that focus on psychiatric disorders using samples from Latin America, which, surprise, there's only like 50. And so we continue to work together to publish our work. And then we have lots of manuscripts underway, as well as analysis for several psychiatric disorders and traits. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Yes? Oh.
Am I first? Cool. Hi, I'm JP, he, him pronouns, UNC Chapel Hill. I love seeing variant to function studies. And I'm currently at the NIH doing some science policy, and this talk made me think about impact and return of research value, right? So you talk a lot about like the infrastructure to do the science, but how in the world is this going to actually go back to patients in Latin America?
Mhm.
What does the dissemination of results plan look like?
Right. So I have one example of that. So like we've been able to leverage the membership of the LAGC to like kind of help another study that's focused on obsessive compulsive disorder, and we're collecting over 5,000 cases for OCD. And actually that study has a lot of our members that are of the PIs that are doing the work on the ground are actually like very involved in social media. They're not scientists. They're like OCD advocates. And so I think they either provide treatment, they're OCD advocates beyond like the geneticists that are part of the group. And our idea is that kind of for eating disorders, they also have efforts in like similarly, and to keep kind of doing that across disorders. And for when we're doing new collection, we're really trying to partner with like the communities, and so that it's like built from the ground up. So you have community partnerships from the beginning, where sort of like what are their needs and wants in terms of genetic studies before trying to we're not trying to like go grab the samples and leave. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Great talk, thank you. Going along with what you just said about going down to communities, in many of these areas where there is lack of collected data,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe also another reason why the historical data may have been dominated by European ancestry might be because in these other areas there might not be a recognition, for example, of things such as mental disease.
Absolutely.
Well, for example, where I was born and raised, like that's just not something that's part of
Yeah.
our vocabulary. So how much do you think that contribute to that lack of data, and what type of stuff are being done to overcome these community barriers and start even identifying the patients that need to be sampled, because as you know, most of them are not considered to be mentally ill or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So there's several other initiatives. So there's Neuromex, so which is doing like both education and collection in Mexico, there's an Africa work group in the PGC, and there's like NeuroGas, which is genome, I think like genomics of African populations, and there's all of those have capacity building efforts. So from like training like psychiatrists on genetics, so they can if they're getting their training, they can build like a research enterprise where they get funding and have access to mentors, have access to how to set up a lab, how to do collection, how to do genomic analysis. It has to be through partnerships, at least for now, right? Like for like collaborations. But the idea is to build capacity in these places. There's a lot of issues in Latin America also with reducing stigma in terms of mental illness, but also I think the genetics helps to also kind of like educate that there's a lot of like things that are outside of people's controls, that there's something that there's an interaction with the environment, but that there's a genetic basis to most psychiatric disorders. And so yes, I think we need to keep having partnerships with like clinicians and like community like organizers for this.
Thank you so much. We'll take a break, and thank you.